Drifter found an Apache woman staked out in the desert with a sign carved into a wooden post beside her. Horse thief, left to die. But William Garrett had seen those eyes before, 6 months ago when he was dying in the same desert and an angel led him to water. Now someone had tried to bury that angel under the blazing sun. New Mexico Territory, fall of 1873. The afternoon sun beat down on the Chihuahuan Desert like a hammer on an anvil, turning the air into something you had to fight to breathe. The Sangre de Cristo mountains rose in the distance like broken teeth, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of winter. But down here in the flats, there was nothing but sand, scrub brush, and heat that could kill a man in hours. William Garrett had been riding these wastelands for 3 months, following rumors of a silver strike near the old Spanish mines. His horse was lean but strong, his water was running low, and his luck had been as scarce as shade. But something kept pulling him deeper into the desert, some gut feeling that told him there was still hope hidden in this endless expanse of thorns and sand. The buzzards gave her away. A black spiral against the white-hot sky, circling something with the patience of death itself. William had seen enough desert graves to know what that meant, but something made him ride toward them anyway. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the kind of stubbornness that had kept him alive this long in country that didn't forgive mistakes. What he found made his blood run cold and his heart hammer against his ribs like a caged bird. She was staked out spread eagle in a small clearing between 2 massive saguaro cacti, her wrists and ankles tied to wooden stakes driven deep into the hardpan. The ropes had cut into her skin where she'd fought against them, leaving raw, bloody wounds that had already started to attract flies. She wore what had once been a white cotton dress, now torn and stained with dirt, blood, and the yellow dust that covered everything in this God-forsaken place. Her long black hair was spread around her head like a dark halo, and her lips were cracked and swollen from thirst. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold when she turned her head to look at him. Those eyes, dark as mountain pools, filled with pain but not broken, not defeated, he'd seen them before. 6 months ago, when he'd been dying of thirst in this same desert, following a dream that led him to a hidden spring. He'd thought it was a vision, an angel, something brought on by sun sickness. But those eyes were real, and they were looking at him like she recognized him too. Beside her, driven into the ground like a grave marker, was a wooden post with words carved deep into the weathered wood. Horse thief, left to die. Jesus Christ, he whispered, swinging down from his saddle and pulling out his knife. What did they do to you? She tried to speak, but only a croak came out. Her lips moved, forming words in Apache, but no sound followed. William worked at the ropes, the hemp fibers tough as wire under the desert sun. Easy now, he said, his voice gentle, despite the rage building in his chest. I'm gonna get you out of here. Just hold on. The first stake came free with a grunt of effort, then the second. She tried to sit up and collapsed immediately, her strength gone after hours under the merciless sun. He caught her before she could fall back onto the burning sand, surprised by how light she was, how fragile. She was burning with fever, her skin hot and dry as old leather. He lifted her in his arms. She weighed no more than a child, and carried her to the shade of the nearest saguaro. She held on to his shirt with what little strength she had left, and when he looked down at her face in the filtered light, he knew for certain. This was the woman who had saved his life in the desert, the one who had appeared like a miracle when he was dying of thirst, who had somehow led him to water when there was no water to be found. Someone had tried to murder her, left her staked out in the sun to die like a rabid dog. He poured water from his canteen onto his bandana and touched it to her lips. She drank desperately, her throat working as she tried to swallow. Most of it ran down her chin, but some of it got through, and her eyes focused on his face with something like hope. "You," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible. "The dying man, by the spring." "Yeah," he said softly. "That was me. You saved my life. And now, you save mine." I looked out at the desert shimmering in the afternoon heat, and back at the woman in his arms. The angel who had led me to water wasn't a dream. She was real, and someone had tried to bury her under the blazing sun. "Not yet," he said, lifting her more securely in his arms. "But I'm going to get you somewhere safe, and then we're going to find the bastards who did this. Follow my story until the end and tell me the city you're watching from, because this tale of desert justice and love that beat death itself needs to be heard in every town from here to California."
3 days passed before she was strong enough to speak more than a few words at a time. William had carried her 15 miles north to a hidden canyon he'd discovered weeks earlier, where a natural spring fed a small oasis of cottonwood trees and desert grass. He'd built a shelter from his canvas tarp and ocotillo poles, tended her like she was made of glass, fed her broth made from jerky and the roots she'd pointed out with shaking fingers. Her name was Maria Santos. She told him this in a voice still rough from thirst, sitting in the shade of the cottonwoods with his spare blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The story came out in pieces, like broken pottery that had to be put together to see the whole picture. She had been a guide, she said, the best in the territory. For 5 years she had led wagon trains through the desert, knowing every waterhole, every safe passage, every hidden danger that could kill a family in the space between heartbeats. She knew the land like some people knew their prayers, every canyon, every ridge, every secret place where a man could find life or death, depending on which path he chose. "I learned from my grandfather," she said, staring at the spring that bubbled up from the rocks like a miracle. "He taught me the old ways, the Apache ways, how to read the sky, how to find water in the driest place, how to walk 200 miles and never lose your way." William listened, cleaning his rifle in the shade. He'd been wandering these deserts for months, but he'd learned more about staying alive in 3 days with Maria than in all his years of drifting. The wagon train came from Missouri. 43 people, families mostly, good people, but scared. They knew nothing about the desert, nothing about staying alive when the sun tries to kill you. The wagon master was a man named Clayton Morse, big, loud, with a beard like a thorn bush and hands that had never done honest work. He'd hired Maria in Santa Fe, paying her $5 a day to guide the train through the worst stretch of desert between the Rio Grande and California. At first, everything was good. We made good time, found water where others found only sand. The family started to trust me. The children learned some Apache words, taught me some English songs. But something had been wrong from the beginning. Morse carried too much gold for an honest wagon master. His supplies were too good, his weapons too new, and he kept asking questions about army patrols, about Apache camps, about which routes the cavalry used to move supplies. Maria had begun to suspect that Morse wasn't just leading settlers to California. He was mapping the territory for someone else, someone who paid very well for information about military movements and unprotected wagon trains. "I started to watch him," she said. "I saw him writing in a book, drawing maps, marking places where soldiers come and go. And I saw the way he looked at the family's money, their jewelry, like a coyote looking at sheep. The truth came out halfway through the journey, in a place called Devil's Canyon, where the walls rose like prison bars, and there was only one way in or out. Morse had been working with a band of renegades, Mexican traders who sold guns to hostile Apache and Comanche in exchange for stolen goods and captives. He planned to kill them all, Maria whispered, her voice breaking. Every family, take their money, their wagons, sell the women and children to slavers, then blame it on an Apache raid. When Maria had tried to warn the families, Morse had caught her. He'd beaten her senseless, then told the settlers that she'd been caught trying to signal Apache warriors, that she was planning to lead them into an ambush. He said I stole horses, that I was guiding Apache to attack innocent people. The families were so scared, they believed him. They let him tie me up like a criminal. Morse had taken her out into the desert at dawn, staked her out in the sun to die slowly, while he told everyone that she'd escaped in the night. The families had gone on without a guide, trusting Morse to lead them through country that would kill them without proper knowledge of the water sources. They're probably all dead now, Maria said, tears sliding down her cheeks. Those children, those mothers, all dead because I couldn't stop him. William reached across the small fire and took her hand. Her fingers were small but strong, worn from years of hard work. It ain't your fault, he said quietly. You tried to save them. That bastard Morse, he's the one with blood on his hands. She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. You believe me? I believe you. He squeezed her hand gently. And I'm going to help you stop him.
The next morning, Maria drew maps in the sand beside the spring. Her finger traced lines and curves with the precision of someone who had walked every mile, climbed every ridge, suffered through every waterless stretch between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. Morse will come back, she said, sketching out the canyon system south of their position. He always comes back to check his kill sites, make sure no evidence is left behind. That's how he's stayed free so long. William knelt beside her, studying the rough map. His years as a Texas Ranger, before the prospecting bug bit him, had taught him to read land like a book, but Maria's knowledge went deeper than maps and surveying. She understood the land the way water understood stone, by flowing through it, finding every crack and hidden passage. There, she pointed to a narrow canyon that branched off from the main trail. Box Canyon, only one way in, one way out. My grandfather showed me this place when I was a little girl. He called it Devil's Trap. You want to lead him in there? Yes, but first we have to make him come to us. Her eyes hardened. Morse thinks I'm dead, buzzard food scattered across the desert. But if he hears that an Apache woman is alive, is talking to lawmen, telling stories about murdered wagon trains, she smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He'll come running. They spent 3 days getting ready. William used his mining knowledge to set charges in the canyon walls, small amounts of black powder positioned to bring down rock slides that would block the only exit. Maria showed him plants that could be crushed into powders that would make horses bolt, roots that could be brewed into tea that would make a man sick enough to fight poorly, but not die. I don't want to kill him quick, she explained as they worked. I want him to suffer like those families suffered, like I suffered under that sun. But their real weapon was Maria's knowledge of every water source, every hidden trail, every shortcut that could turn a 3-day journey into a day's hard ride. While Morse would be forced to follow the main trails with his men and pack animals, she could move through the desert like smoke, appearing where she wasn't expected, disappearing when pursuit came too close. On the 4th day, William rode into the town of Las Cruces, 40 miles south of their hidden canyon. He found the sheriff drinking in the saloon in the late afternoon, a fat, lazy man named Kowalski, who was more interested in collecting bribes than catching criminals. I want to report a murder, William said, loud enough for the whole saloon to hear. Apache woman named Maria Santos. She's got information about wagon trains being attacked, families being killed for their money.
Kowalski barely looked up from his cards. Apache woman? They come and go like tumbleweeds, Fran. Probably just wandered off into the desert. She says a man named Clayton Morse has been working with renegades, setting up massacres, stealing from settlers. William's voice carried to every corner of the room. Says she can prove it, too. Got herself stories that would hang a dozen men. That got attention. Several men at nearby tables stopped their conversations to listen. Word would spread. It always did in small towns where gossip was the only entertainment. And if Morse had any friends or spies in Las Cruces, they'd carry the news to him within days. William rode back to the desert, taking a roundabout route that added 20 miles to the journey, but let him check for pursuit. Sure enough, on the second day, he spotted dust on the back trail. 3 riders, pushing their horses hard, following his tracks with the determination of men who had urgent business. Maria was waiting at their oasis, but she'd moved their gear to a hidden camp 2 miles north of the original site. She'd been busy. The new camp was invisible from any direction, tucked into a grove of desert willows with a clear view of all approaches and the spring within easy reach. They took the bait, William reported. 3 men, well armed, riding like they're in a hurry to kill somebody. Good. Now we see if Clayton Morse is as smart as he thinks he is. The trap was simple but deadly. Maria would let herself be seen at the mouth of Devil's Trap Canyon, apparently alone and unaware of pursuit. When Morse and his men followed her into the narrow passage, William would trigger the charges that sealed the exit. Then it would be 3 men with nowhere to run against 2 people who knew every inch of the land. What if he doesn't come himself? What if he just sends his boys? He'll come, Maria's voice was certain. I'm the only one who can identify him, the only witness to what he did. He can't afford to let other men kill me. Too much risk they miss, or that I escape again. Clayton Morse will want to watch me die with his own eyes. That night they lay side by side under the desert stars, sharing warmth against the surprising cold that came when the sun went down. William had seen plenty of death in his years as a ranger, had killed men who needed killing, and lost sleep over the ones that maybe didn't. But lying there with Maria pressed against his side, her breathing soft and steady in the darkness, he realized this was different. This wasn't about law or duty or even justice. This was about protecting something precious, something that had already been taken from the world once and couldn't be allowed to disappear again. William, she whispered in the darkness. Yeah? When this is over, when Morse is dead, what then? He was quiet for a long moment, listening to the coyotes singing in the distance. I reckon that depends on what you want. I want... She paused, as if trying to find words for something she'd never said out loud. I want to stop running. I want to find a place where I can use what I know to help people, not just survive. Maybe guide honest families, teach children about the desert, show them how to live with the land instead of fighting it. That sounds like a good life. What about you? You going to prospect these deserts forever? Well, I already found the most valuable thing in this desert. Don't reckon I need to keep digging. She turned in his arms then, and even in the starlight he could see her eyes, the same eyes that had appeared to him like a miracle when he was dying in the desert, the eyes that had watched him with trust and hope, even when she was staked out to die under the blazing sun. I love you, she whispered in the darkness. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, he said, and kissed her under the endless sky. They came in the late afternoon, just as Maria had predicted. 3 riders pushing hard across the desert flats, their horses covered with sweat and alkali dust from the long chase. Clayton Morse rode in the lead, a big man with a beard streaked gray and eyes like chips of flint. He wore a cavalry officer's coat, though William doubted he'd earned it honestly, and carried enough weapons to outfit a small army. The 2 men with him looked like the kind of trash you'd find in any border cantina. Hard faces, harder hands, the sort who'd kill for $1 and feel good about the bargain. One was Mexican, thin as a snake and twice as dangerous. The other looked like he might have been handsome once before the desert and bad choices carved the humanity out of his face. Maria waited at the mouth of Devil's Trap Canyon, sitting on a flat rock in plain sight. She'd braided her hair with desert marigolds, Apache custom for a woman going to war, and wore a white cotton dress that made her look like a spirit against the red stone walls. Her rifle lay across her knees, and she hummed softly as she watched the riders approach. From his position, 200 yards up the canyon wall, William had a clear view of everything. The charges were set, the fuses ready. All he had to do was wait for the signal. Morse pulled up his horse 50 yards from Maria, well outside rifle range. He was careful, the mark of a man who'd lived this long by never taking unnecessary chances. "Well, well," he called out, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Little Maria, heard tell you were dead." "Not yet, senor, but the day is young." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Always used to be a mouthy little bitch. Should have known you'd be too stubborn to die properly under that sun." "Those families you murdered, Morse," Maria said, standing slowly. "The children, the mothers, they haunt my dreams, Morse. Every night I see their faces." "They died stupid," Morse replied with a shrug. "Trusted the wrong people, believed the wrong stories. Natural selection, you might say. And now you come to kill me because I know the truth." "Nothing personal, girl, just business." He gestured to his men. "But I'll make it quick if you tell me who else you've been talking to." Maria smiled, the same smile she'd worn when explaining how she wanted Morse to suffer. "Many people, senor. Lawmen, soldiers, newspaper writers, all very interested in stories about murdered wagon trains." Morse's face darkened. He'd been played, and he knew it, but he was in too deep now to back down. "Killer," he snarled to his men. Then Maria did something that froze all three men in their saddles. She threw back her head and made a sound like nothing William had ever heard, a long wailing cry that seemed to come from the stones themselves, wild and fierce and absolutely fearless. It was the Apache war cry her grandfather had taught her, the sound warriors made when they rode into battle knowing they might not ride out. It echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of the desert itself, and for a moment even Morse looked shaken. Then she turned and ran into the canyon. The three riders spurred their horses after her, exactly as planned. They thundered into the narrow passage between the towering walls, focused completely on their prey. Morse was shouting orders, his men spreading out as much as the tight space allowed. When they were 100 yards inside the canyon, past the point of no return, William touched flame to the first fuse. The explosion shook the earth like thunder. A section of the canyon wall came down in a roar of dust and flying stone, blocking the entrance completely. The horses screamed and reared, throwing one of Morse's men into the rocks. The Mexican managed to keep his seat, but his mount was limping, probably hurt by flying rocks. "What the hell?" Morse spun his horse in circles, looking for the source of the blast. Then he saw William, standing on a ledge 50 feet above them, rifle in his hands. "Good afternoon, boys. Welcome to Devil's Trap." Morse raised his own rifle, but William was already moving, disappearing behind a boulder as bullets sparked off stone. The canyon had become a killing ground, with William holding the high ground and Maria somewhere in the maze of rocks and shadows at the far end. It should have been over quickly. 3 men trapped in a box canyon with no way out, against 2 people who knew every stone and crack. But Morse hadn't survived this long by being stupid. He quickly realized that charging blindly would just get his men killed.
"Spread out," he barked. "Find cover. Make them come to us." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse that lasted through the heat of the afternoon. William had the advantage of height, but he couldn't get a clear shot without exposing himself to return fire. Maria had vanished completely. One moment she was visible at the far end of the canyon, the next she was gone like smoke. The turning point came when the Mexican tried to climb the canyon wall, thinking he could get above William's position. He was halfway up when Maria appeared behind him like a ghost, moving silent as shadow along a ledge she hadn't even seen. Her knife took him in the kidney, and he fell 40 feet to the canyon floor without making a sound.
Now it was 2 against 2, but Morse still had advantages. He and his remaining man had taken cover behind fallen boulders that gave them protection from above, and they had enough ammunition to hold out for hours if necessary. That's when Maria showed why she was the best guide in the territory. She knew about the hidden spring at the back of the canyon, the one that had saved Apache warriors during cavalry pursuits, the secret water source that had allowed her grandfather's people to survive sieges that should have killed them. But she also knew something else. The spring was fed by an underground stream that ran beneath the canyon floor, and that stream could be redirected. While William kept Morse and his man pinned down with rifle fire, Maria worked her way through passages only she knew existed, carrying the small charges William had prepared for just this possibility. She placed them carefully at 3 points where the underground stream ran closest to the surface. When the charges went off, the explosions were muffled by tons of rock and earth, but the effect was immediate. The hidden spring began to flow faster, and water started seeping up through cracks in the canyon floor. At first, it was just dampness, easily ignored by men focused on staying alive. But as the minutes passed, the dampness became puddles, and the puddles became streams, and the streams began to rise. "What the hell is happening?" Morse's remaining man, the pretty boy who wasn't pretty anymore, looked around wildly as water swirled around his boots. Morse understood first. He'd seen flash floods before, knew how quickly they could turn a dry wash into a raging river. But this was different. The water wasn't coming from the sky or from upstream. It was rising from below, as if the earth itself was bleeding. "She's drowning us," he said, his voice tight with the first real fear William had heard from him. "That bitch is drowning us like rats in a trap." They tried to climb then, abandoning cover in a desperate attempt to reach higher ground. But the canyon walls were steep and treacherous, and they were fighting panic as much as gravity. William's first shot took the pretty boy in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing back into the rising water. He thrashed for a moment, then went still, face down in the flood. Morse made it higher, using handholds that would have challenged a mountain goat. He was strong and desperate, and for a moment it looked like he might actually escape the trap. But then Maria appeared above him, standing on a ledge with her rifle aimed at his heart. "Clayton Morse, I told you I wanted you to suffer." He looked up at her, hanging from the rock face like a spider, water rising beneath his feet. "You can't do this, girl. I'm unarmed." "Were those families armed when you murdered them? Were those children carrying rifles when you sold them to slavers?" Morse tried to climb higher, but there was nowhere to go. The ledge above him was too far. The handholds below him were disappearing under the flood. "Please," he gasped, "I got money. Gold, more than you ever seen." "I don't want your money, senor. I want justice." She could have shot him then. One bullet, and the man who murdered innocent families would be dead. But Maria had learned patience from the desert and justice from her grandfather's people. She waited. The water kept rising. Morse's strength began to fail. His fingers, slippery with sweat and spray, started to lose their grip on the stone. When he finally fell, the splash echoed off the canyon walls like a gunshot. He surfaced once, arms flailing, mouth open in a scream that the water cut short. Then the current took him, and Clayton Morse disappeared into the flood he'd tried so hard to escape. The water went down by sunset, leaving behind a canyon floor scraped clean. The bodies of Morse and his men were gone, swept away by the artificial flood to feed the desert scavengers. All that remained was wet stone and the knowledge that justice had finally been served. William and Maria made their way out of the canyon as the first stars appeared, riding double on his horse with their arms around each other. They said little. There was no need for words when the silence held everything that mattered. They spent that night at their old camp by the spring, sharing beans and coffee and the quiet satisfaction of people who had faced evil and won. In the morning, they would ride to Santa Fe, where William would file a report with the federal marshals about the fate of Clayton Morse and his gang. The wagon trains that had disappeared, the families that had died, their stories would finally be told, their murders acknowledged, if not avenged. But first, there was this, firelight on Maria's face, her hand in his, the promise of a future that stretched out before them like an uncharted trail. "What now?" he asked, echoing her question from the night before their battle. "Now we build something," she said simply. "A ranch, maybe, somewhere near water with good grass for horses. We guide honest families through the desert, teach them what the land can give if they treat it with respect." Sounds like a good life. The best life. She smiled, and in that smile he saw everything he'd been searching for in these deserts. Not gold or silver, but something infinitely more precious. Because now I know that some promises are worth keeping, and some people are worth saving. They were married 3 weeks later, in the little church in Mesilla, with a priest who spoke Spanish and a handful of witnesses who didn't ask too many questions about the bride's past or the groom's scars. Maria wore a white dress that caught the desert sunlight like captured snow, and William wore his only clean shirt and a smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. The ranch they built was small but successful, situated in a valley where an underground spring fed a year-round creek. They guided wagon trains through the safe passes, taught children about desert survival, and slowly built a reputation as people who could be trusted with lives and dreams. Maria never forgot the families that Morse had murdered, but she learned to carry their memory like a prayer instead of a wound. She named the spring behind their house Memoria, memory, and every morning she would walk there to say the names of the dead and promise them that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. William gave up prospecting, but never stopped digging. He dug wells for their neighbors, irrigation ditches for their crops, root cellars that would keep food cool through the blazing summers. His hands, scarred by years of hard rock and harder choices, learned gentleness in the soil that fed their garden. In the evenings they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains where they had first found each other. Maria would speak of the day's work, the family they had guided safely through Devil's Pass, the spring they had helped a neighbor locate, the Apache word she had taught the school children. William would talk about the well he was digging, the fence that needed mending, the foal that had been born that morning. Simple things, ordinary things, the kind of life that most people took for granted, but that felt like a miracle to two souls who had almost been lost to the desert's cruelty. And sometimes, when the wind was right and the stars were bright, Maria would tell stories of her grandfather's time, when the Apache rode free through these deserts, and the land belonged to those who understood its moods and secrets. She would speak of warriors and spirits, of hidden springs and sacred places, of a way of life that was passing like smoke, but lived on in the knowledge she carried. "Will you teach our children these stories?" William asked one night, his hand resting on her belly where their first child grew. "Yes," she said, covering his hand with hers. "They will know who they are, where they come from, and why the desert chose to spare us when it could have buried us like so many others." Their son was born the following spring, during the season when the wildflowers bloomed in impossible numbers across the valley floor. They named him Gabriel, messenger of God, because he arrived like an answer to prayers they hadn't known they were praying. He grew up bilingual and bicultural, equally comfortable with Apache tracking signs and Texas Ranger stories, with desert survival and Christian hymns. His mother taught him to read the land like scripture. His father taught him to work with his hands and keep his word. He learned that justice was something you made, not something you waited for, and that love was the only treasure worth dying for. Years later, when Gabriel had children of his own, he would tell them the story of how his grandmother had been staked out in the desert and left to die, and how his father had found her and cut her free. He would tell them about the flood that had swallowed the bad men, about the ranch built from love and determination, about the promise that some things were worth keeping no matter what the cost. But that was still to come. On this night, with the desert wind singing through the cottonwoods and the first stars appearing in the purple sky, William and Maria Morrison sat on their porch and watched the world turn toward tomorrow. She had been an angel in the desert when he was dying of thirst. He had been salvation when she was staked out to die under the blazing sun. Together they had built something that would outlast the mountains, a family, a home, a love that had beaten death itself. Because sometimes, in the wild country where life and death rode together like old companions, miracles happened. Not the kind you read about in books, but the kind you lived through day by day, season by season, choice by choice. The kind that made you believe that even in the harshest desert, love could bloom like water from stone. Until we meet again on the frontier, ride steady, love deep, and never forget that sometimes the most valuable treasure isn't gold or silver. It's the person willing to cut your chains and carry you home.